Bum 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 bum.
Tomatoes?
Hello, welcome to video 4. What is capsule trace for objects? So this is a pretty simple node. It is just like our other trace nodes, except it uses a capsule for the trace type. So the collision is basically going to be based on a capsule itself. And if you don't know what a capsule is, it is this shape here, where it's basically a sphere, except with one elongated side, or a height. So let's look at the node itself. It's pretty simple. You have a start and an end, like any other trace. You have a radius. This is basically going to be how round our sphere is. And then a half height. Basically from the middle to the top, how tall is it? If we were to, for example, put 50, well, not 500, 50 and 50 for a radius and half height, and we ran this, well, our item is basically going to be a sphere. And you can see it wrapped around this sphere, which is my starting object. If we put this back to, let's say, 100, then we're going to end up with something roughly 200 for the height and 50 for the radius, which we can see here. So let me go ahead and shut off my trace by channel debug, because I left it on, and let's go back to our capsule. The difference between this one and our by channel is we simply have an object type instead of a channel type. And our object type is pretty simple. It's going to be one of our object collision settings in project. Collision, and you have your object channels. You have your default object channels, which are, let's go here, go to our object type, and we can add a new one. You have your default object channels: world static, dynamic, pawn, physics body, vehicle, and destructible. And then you have custom ones, which I've created, called custom object channel and enemy. And of course I created them under project settings, collision, for new object channel. Now, of course, only object types, object channels, so our object types, that respond to blocking are going to be affected by this. If you don't block, it's going to ignore it. What I mean by this is, well, let's play. Let's look, and here's our trace. Let me walk in front of it, and you'll notice our trace is stopped by basically the pawn. If I was to do show collision and do it properly, we're going to see the collision volume around my player. And we're going to see where it's hitting against the collision volume on my sphere trace. Sphere trace. Capsule trace, yeah. And you can see that by the little square red marks. That's because my character is a part of the pawn for the type. Let me delete the duplicate one. So it's going to hit against it. It also hits against the world static. Well, if we were to hit play, you'll notice that it's not stopping on the square right here. It's actually going through the square, and it's hitting this wall behind it. The wall is set to world static. This cube and its items on top of it are not. Therefore, they are not going to block the trace. And that's useful when you're trying to trace specific objects or object types. Like, let's say, for example, you're tracing forward, and you want to see if your character can fit through a door. Your door may be of type door, or maybe it's of type world static, which is one of your defaults, or maybe you make something custom, like you want it to be a blocking volume, so you call it blocking volume, and you want to trace only against those things. That way it doesn't get stopped by other players or projectiles or things like that. Channel's really good when you have things defined. Not channel, object. Object is really good when you have things defined by a type, for example, a door or a static piece of your world or landscape. Going to our next options, we have trace complex. Pretty simple. Basically, is it going to trace against the complex collision or the simple collision? For example, if you have a door, is it going to trace against every part of the door, including openings and holes? Or are you going to use it something simplified, such as a box collider, which just goes around the entire thing? Actors to ignore is an array of actors that it will ignore. That's it. After it's gone ahead and done a trace and it's hit something, if it is part of our actors to ignore, so an array of actors, maybe I'm going to ignore other players, it's going to not count that as a hit, and it will continue on. Draw debug is simple. This is how long we're going to draw a debug frame. If we hit none, you will see none. Right here we are casting and hitting with nothing for debugging. Debugging is this. You're going to see our starting point, our actual line itself as it goes to the end, and then we're going to see what we hit. That is our debug type. You have one frame, duration, and persistent, and this just changes how long it's going to be on the screen. Ignore self should be self-explanatory. this blueprint, whoops, right here is firing off our trace. It is of a certain type, and it may collide when I shoot off my trace because it's casting it from inside. If we have ignore self turned on, we are going to ignore the blueprint that this is fired from, and we're going to ignore anything inside of it so that way it doesn't trigger on itself. It's useful if, for example, it's inside of another blueprint or you're firing through something else. Maybe you're going to fire through a player and something as part of the camera starting point, trace starting point from a camera. You might want to just basically ignore self so your self doesn't trigger. Our outputs are a Boolean and a hit result. The Boolean will tell us if we hit something or not. So in this case, I hooked it up and I've told it to go ahead and print out what we're hitting. And as you can see here, we're hitting the sphere. And if I was to go to here, let's go ahead and unhook that. Let's go ahead and close that. Let's make sure we go back to the correct node. So once we hook up the correct node and we tell it to go ahead and show us what we got, we'll go ahead and print string. It'll tell us to print out what we're hitting. We'll go ahead and hit play. And now you can see it's hitting our backing wall. If we were to walk in front of it, now it's hitting our generic character and then backing wall. Since I disabled debug, it makes it a little difficult. We turn it back on one frame and now we can actually see it as it's adjusting and hitting appropriately, as you can see there. So that is what our outputs are. Again, a hit result is covered in a separate video, but it's basically what you hit and what it consists of. And return value of basically if we hit something or not is useful if you don't want to run any code if you've hit nothing. One thing to note, you can actually have your capsule trace basically cast from where it is rather than going somewhere. And to do that, you would basically set your endpoint to a very small distance. Your endpoint cannot consist of the starting point. Your starting and your ending, if they are the same, will have an issue. You're not going to get anything to hit. If we go ahead and we set up our starting and our ending point with our ending being slightly different. So in this case, I've added 0.1 to our Z. We're going to go ahead and actually get something once we hit. And if I was to, for example, rate this to 100 and 200. Oop, that's 2000. Go ahead and hit play. We got a bigger one. And now you can see it's hitting the floor. If we were to not have an extra distance in there, basically, it's got to trace at least a very small amount in order for it to actually do a trace. If your starting and end are the same, even though it looks like it's in one spot, it's technically not. So because they're not the same, it will actually do a trace. So that's something to keep in mind. And with that, we're going to wrap up our capsule trace for objects node.